Hey everyone, I'm Congressman Castro, and of course, proud to represent my hometown of San Antonio, Texas, known as Military City, USA. And I'd like to wish everybody a Happy New Year. It was, at least for the first few days, kind of a quiet New Year. And then we got to 2 or 3 in the morning last night. And so by now, I take it y'all have seen that the United States invaded Venezuela and ousted Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. Now, remember, this is at a time where Americans, millions of Americans, are facing a situation where their healthcare coverage is either going to cost them a lot more, or some of them are no longer going to be able to afford healthcare coverage. And Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress let those healthcare subsidies lapse. And so people are facing huge healthcare bills. For me, my healthcare insurance went up $2,400 for the year. So about $200 a month. Now, the reason I mention that is because if you watched this press conference a little while ago, you heard President Trump say that the United States is going to run Venezuela and going to fix Venezuela. How much do you think that's going to cost us? Do you think it's going to cost us $1,000? $10,000? That is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor. Listening to that press conference, it's almost as if we learned nothing from the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, all of those lessons. Now, let's go back a little bit and add some context here. And I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee and have since I got to Congress in 2013, and also on the Intelligence Committee. And within the Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm the ranking member. Remember, you have the chair with the majority party and the ranking member from the minority party. So I'm the ranking member as a Democrat on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. That's the subcommittee that oversees our relationships with Latin America and the Caribbean. So some quick context about the United States and Latin America. Over the years, the United States got heavily involved during the Cold War period in the governing and the politics of Latin America. And what we did was really interesting, but also incredibly destabilizing. We treated every right-wing leader as a friend and every left-wing leader as a foe. And so we backed some terrible people over the years. We backed Pinochet in Chile, for example, who killed so many people in his country. We backed governments in Latin America that disappeared people. Their families never found them. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying that Nicolas Maduro is a good guy. I believe that he abused his people. I believe that the election results in Venezuela, these last elections, were suspicious, and that the government, Maduro's government, never provided proof that they actually won the election. But think about this. If this was about bad leaders in countries around the world, we'd probably be taking out half of the leaders in the world. If this was about communism, then China wouldn't be our biggest trading partner, which it is. If this was about drugs, then Donald Trump wouldn't have pardoned the former president of Honduras, who's one of the largest drug traffickers the United States has ever known. And so what is it about? Well, President Trump told us in his own words, even before the events of early this morning, that it was about oil and it's about land. And during the press conference today, he affirmed that. He basically said that it's about oil. It's about the valuable resources. So here we have an American president using the American military to overthrow the leader of a country for oil, for resources, and for land. So how do we then stand up or speak out against China if it moves on Taiwan? How do we speak up against what Putin does in Ukraine? What gives us the moral authority, and I think President Trump is taking it away, to actually stand firm and lead the world against those kinds of actions? Now, when we think about the power of an American president to take the country to war, it's true. Presidents of different political stripes, Republican and Democrats, have done strikes, for example, in different countries. And I want to tell you something else that's true. The Congress has also, for many years now, taken a back seat on a lot of these decisions. And people wonder, well, why is that? Remember, the Congress has a constitutional and statutory authority to allow it to make decisions about war. I don't believe that the American people elected a full House of Representatives and a full Senate, 535 people, to sit on the sidelines while these big decisions are being made, to literally have no voice and no vote at all on this huge decision about going to war. But I came to the Congress in 2013, obviously after the votes on the Iraq war were taken, for example. But in talking to other members of Congress, in my committee work, just my best sense of one of the things and one of the reasons that Congress hasn't asserted its authority is because those are tough political decisions. And when people took that vote on the Iraq war, and they did so because the intelligence community, and at that time the Bush administration, was talking about the weapons of mass destruction, for example. Members of Congress ultimately felt when those weapons of mass destruction weren't found, when so many American service members died, when there was so much carnage over there, they felt duped, just like the country did. They felt like the country did that we went into that war under false pretenses and that we shouldn't have done it. And they understood also that they had taken a vote to allow it. And so what happened was politicians, they decided, hey, I don't want to take those tough votes. I don't want to take votes that are going to come back and haunt me and make my own political career difficult. Look, and it's true on different issues, not only on war, but on different issues, there's different tough votes in Congress that are tough to take. But I think that's why the American people in each of our districts send us to Congress to take those votes. And so because the Congress became more reluctant to jump in the middle of these votes, I think because they felt stung by being duped before and didn't want it to happen again and didn't want to pay a political price anymore, the executive then started taking more power. They took advantage of that reluctance and usurped more and more power to make these decisions by themselves. But President Trump now has taken this to a whole other level. When he holds a press conference and basically says, yeah, this is about the oil. We're going to go in there and we're going to fix the oil infrastructure and we're going to run Venezuela. Where are you going to run Venezuela from? You're going to run Venezuela from Washington, D.C.? Even though the Congress had no say at all in this whole operation? When we were briefed by the administration, including Secretary Rubio, the week before, I think it was a week before we left for the holiday break, for the Christmas break, I asked Secretary Rubio directly whether they would come in front of Congress for an AUMF, an authorization for use of military force. In other words, to get permission for land strikes, because the president had been talking about doing these land strikes. And Secretary Rubio said, almost a quote, we'll get permission, or basically we'll go in front of Congress for anything that requires an AUMF. That's what he said. We'll come to Congress for anything that requires an AUMF. So all those explosions, the deployment of all the military, the ousting of a leader of another country, none of that requires authorization for use of military force. None of that would require authorization by Congress. Congress needs to reassert itself and its authority, its constitutional and statutory authority in declaring war. Now look, it's true if you look at the news, and as I've talked to some Venezuelans today and in the weeks before, there are folks who are happy that Nicolas Maduro is gone. That's true. Like I said, he was not a good guy to his people. And in the short term, for some, I think they may feel like, hey, we didn't want this guy here anymore, and now he's gone. But we've seen from the past, from history, that oftentimes countries, in this case the United States, they have two choices. Either it can be a quick operation where you go in and get out. That was Panama in 1989, I believe, under George H.W. Bush. Or you have a situation like Iraq and Afghanistan where you go in and stay. and also spend a lot of money. And so what President Trump has described is the latter, where you go in there now and you're staying. Now, he didn't rule out boots on the ground, which means he could make a decision in the near future or in the distant future to send troops into Venezuela. So if you go in there, you're now an occupying force. You've got to imagine that there's going to be some part of the country who's going to resist that because they don't want the United States or another government controlling their country and their territory. And so that's where you start to replay the mistakes of Iraq and some of the mistakes of Afghanistan as well. The other thing that we have to watch out for here is that I don't think this is the end of the road with respect to Trump in Latin America. He has gotten very aggressive in the Western Hemisphere. If you looked at his recent national security strategy, he basically talks about these spheres of influence where the United States, essentially, if you read between the lines, and some of it is actually quite clear, basically has any authority to do whatever it wants in the Western Hemisphere. And so let's take you back now, not to the decades of the 60s and 70s and 80s of, supporting right-wing governments in Latin America, but just to January and February and March and so forth of this year, President Trump's term. You remember just in Latin America, the saber rattling with Panama over the Panama Canal, the fight with Petro in Colombia, the interference in the Argentinian elections by injecting billions of dollars just before their elections, and of course, the more naked interference in the Honduran elections that just happened. And so we have to be watchful, because I believe that the president has set up a model and a template to interfere with the Colombian elections that are coming up in 2026. I believe that President Trump will interfere with the presidential elections and the elections in Colombia in 2026. There's also been this question about Mexico, because remember, he's talked about military strikes in Mexico, purportedly against the cartels. But remember, those cartels, they're receiving about 90% of their arms from the United States, from illegal firearms trafficking into Mexico. And I sponsored legislation along with others to try to stop that, to try to help disarm these cartels so they can accomplish the violence and the domination that they have. But within the last few years, and we talked about this in committee as well, I mentioned this, there were a series of bills, pieces of legislation that were proposed by Republican members of Congress. Some of those have now become executive orders by President Trump that I believed were laying the groundwork for him to essentially declare a war with Mexico or initiate some kind of military strikes. And I still think that's true. Designating certain cartels as terrorist organizations, for example. The reclassification of fentanyl. These things that would justify Donald Trump taking unilateral action in Mexico. I hope that that's not the case. I think most Americans don't want to see war with Mexico, just like they didn't want to see war with Venezuela. Don't want us to be spending the money on those things when people are losing their health care coverage, when you have people going to the grocery store and finding it harder and harder to afford groceries and essential items. But that's what we have to be mindful of and watchful for, because I do think that this president could end up taking us there. We're going to be continuing to talk about this throughout the day and obviously into the coming weeks and months. The president needs to give a full briefing to Congress, and the administration needs to give a full briefing to Congress as soon as we're back on Tuesday. Again, Congress was kept in the dark. Marco Rubio says that he called some senators after this operation was launched. Now, remember, this was like at 2 or 3 in the morning, East Coast time. I don't know who was awake at 3 in the morning to take his call, but that's unacceptable. First, that you would tell all of us that you would go get permission from Congress. In that briefing, he said he would get permission from Congress for an AUMF, and then to come back and not even notify or consult with Congress at all is basically sidelined the institution. And that's not in the best interest of the American people, not in the best interest of our country. And so we'll have some time to answer some of your questions. I'll go online here later. Like you, I wasn't counting on this happening, obviously, early this morning or last night. But want to make sure that we're answering people's questions. I've gotten some questions from folks who have family members in Venezuela, for example, that are concerned about what's going on in Caracas and also concerned about where we go from here. Again, President Trump has said that the United States is going to run Venezuela. I believe that they're essentially that he's going to install somebody who is loyal to him, who will allow him to make money for his cronies and for his family members. That's a blueprint that he set up around the world. You think, for example, about Jared Kushner and others talking about condos over in Gaza. You think about Jared Kushner, who was going to be involved in the big Paramount deal recently, but then because of public shame had to back out of that. The Trump company continues to do hotel deals and other real estate deals around the world with governments. And so, yes, a lot of this is not about the country. It's about his own personal fortune and how much money he can make from a particular place and its industry. And in Venezuela, there's a lot of natural resources and a lot of energy. All right? Well, thank you all for joining me, and we'll see you soon.